Good afternoon. Hello. Welcome to this IMPAKT event for Cultural Sunday here in Utrecht. My name is Tobias Revel. This is Natalie Kane. And together we are the curators of IMPAKT 2017, titled Haunted Machines and Wicked Problems, which is taking place from the 25th to 29th of October all over Utrecht, but centered on Het House, which I can't pronounce properly. I did all right. And there we're going to be hosting an international lineup of speakers and artists and technologists and thinkers who are going to be reflecting on this idea of what it means when we talk about the occult in technology, when we talk about hauntology, when we think about ways that we culturally assimilate complex technologies into our lives by making up stories about them, looking at everything from sort of the phenomenon of post-truth and fake news to the Internet of Things and the rise of AI in recent years, I suppose. That's about right? Yeah. Excellent. So today we've got four guests related to the program and taking part in the program. Dan Hassler Forrest. I'm going to introduce them one by one as they come up. Dan Hassler Forrest, Akin Hobart, Simone Nickel, and Raina Hoffman, who are all going to be joining us and talking about some of their specific interests and links to this idea in this program, some of them more direct and some of them less direct.
I guess it's worth mentioning the structure of the programme as well, potentially. So we've got the conference in Het House, which is over 3 days, which will have some sort of site-specific installations in there as well. We've also got an exhibition at Casco Fotodoc and Buck, and Fabiorama, which I guess Raina will introduce later, which we're co-presenting with Spring. I think that's all the venues. I don't know if I've forgotten anyone. Good, yeah. So our first guest, I know we're going to play the trailer, aren't we?
Yeah, we're going to play the trailer. I mean, so the format today is going to be kind of loose. We're calling this a talk show, so it's not such a formal presentation. We invite our guests to discuss some ideas. We're going to keep Google open and bring up tabs as and when it's relevant. It may be that we just talk about Game of Thrones for 2 hours. We don't know yet.
We were over lunch, so yeah.
But, you know, I also invite the audience, if you've got something you desperately need to get off your chest, raise your hand. We'll see what we can do and get this discussion going. And then at the end, we'll bring all the guests on together for a group discussion to wrap up. And after that, we're heading over to the Spielclock Museum for a custom tour at 4:15 of the Spielclock collection. And there's a couple of items in there related to this idea of haunted machines, so certain automata, mechanisms, and so on and so forth that, you know, captivated the people of Europe about 100, 200 years ago, and played a similar role perhaps to our contemporary technology back then. So I'm going to play the little trailer we've got, and then we'll welcome our first guest. Where's the little trailer? No, it's back. There it is. No, it's not. Oh, there it is. There we go.
Suitably epic.
Yeah, it's nice.
Lots of sense.
So our first guest is Dan Hassler Forrest. He's the assistant professor in media and cultural studies, which apparently is a behemoth of a department anyway at the Utrecht University. He's been in a... hang on, that's the wrong bio. Never mind. He writes a lot about pop culture and superheroes and science fiction and what it tells about our society. His latest book is called... Science Fiction, Fantasy and Politics, Transmedia and something.
No, we actually got like a description of the panel, the chapters earlier, and it sounds super interesting. So
come on
up. Yeah.
Saunter on over.
Okay, hi.
Hey, Dan.
Hi.
Cool.
So why don't you begin by telling us a bit about your work with superheroes and pop culture and science fiction?
Is it on? Yeah. Good morning. I don't know. I think I tried for a couple of years to start doing like appropriately scholarly research and constantly failed. So then I just sort of embraced my own inner nerd, and now I get to call myself a science fiction scholar because I guess I wrote my dissertation on superhero movies as a political phenomenon, as something that became like a kind of, that became a huge thing specifically, maybe accidentally, after 9/11. So the PhD, and then later the book that was called Capitalist Superheroes. It's about, I don't know, the way in which popular culture expresses certain political, not so much propaganda, but maybe contradictions, would be a better way of putting it. So ever since, I tried for a couple of years then to get rid of the superhero stigma, but I've given up. I've embraced the superhero now as well, and so all the stuff that I do now is blatantly popular, blatantly commercial, and I guess if I'd have to sort of apologize for it, which I'm reluctant to do, but I'll do it anyway, because it's like we're in good, intellectual company here. It's like my main reason for being so interested. Let me put it differently. My justification, right? My social, economic, and scholarly justification for this is the fact that like pop culture stuff like Star Wars and Game of Thrones, right? Like we experience them as entertainment and therefore as something to relax to and not to think too much about, maybe. But at the same time, they form like a kind of shared language for huge numbers of people in a way that high art really doesn't. So I'm really interested in the ways, on the one hand, that these kinds of phenomena express often a quite, dangerous and unappealing kind of hardcore capitalist ideology. But on the other hand, they can also be used for various forms of activism because fans also appropriate these stories, and there's so many different weird stuff going on in there that they can latch onto them and appropriate them in interesting ways.
Are there examples from pop culture, from either superheroes or science fiction, of where, these stories have been used to challenge the kind of hardcore capitalist narrative that maybe have become very popular, but they're doing something different, using the same tropes and ideas, but they're doing something to counter that dominant narrative?
Yeah. I think the two key examples, I think, are one is older and one is a little bit more recent. The older one is Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which, you can read it when it was published in the 50s or today and see, it's very easy and very, I don't know how easy it is, but it's, to me it's very obvious that it's a very obnoxiously Eurocentric, racist story about, the purity of the elves and how, there's this kind of Western Middle Earth that's being invaded from the south and the east, has to be protected at all costs by these adorable white heterosexual hobbits, so it's all kind of, trying to maintain this mythological European purity and trying to keep it from being infected and succeeding in a way, right? And that's so it's in that sense it's a really reactionary, really, I hate the word problematic, but I guess it's appropriate. But if you put it in its specific popular context of the late 1960s, when college students started reading this. And what they saw in it wasn't so much, maybe they were blind, clearly they were blinded by their white privilege anyway, but they saw in it this kind of allegory about environmentalism and about how young people, even though they seem completely powerless, can actually make a huge difference in the context of a much larger conflict. So the button, and graffiti, Frodo lives, became this was a huge thing in 1969, 1970. It became an expression of a kind of, a very endearing kind of hope, the sense that even when faced with this conflict, the Vietnam War at the time, that people felt powerless to do anything about it, and the growth of the military-industrial complex, a lot of people went out onto the streets to demonstrate against the war wearing these buttons because what they saw was that part of it, right? And so you can salvage things from texts that are really, crazy reactionary. And Tolkien, of course, completely disowned all of that. He's like, no, they're reading it wrong. You're not getting the right thing out of it. It's all about Catholicism and the return of the Messiah. So another thing is the Hunger Games, right? The Hunger Games is this huge, young adult book trilogy that became a popular movie quartet because they needed to make more money, right? Yeah. And there, if you read the books through to the end, which I'm not sure you really even should in this case, or watch the movies all the way up to the end, you see this seemingly feminist empowered heroine, first leading a revolution in a way against this 1% hyper-capitalist elite, which has this interesting anti-capitalist resonance to it. And then at the end, she's like, oh, actually, all revolutions, are finally betrayed. It's really no point to becoming politically involved. And she retreats into the domestic sphere to have babies. So you're like, what? If you're interested in this story for its kind of, revolutionary anti-capitalist potential, which is the reason why I was so interested in it, and for a lot of people, it's really, it kind of betrays that spirit. But there's a really interesting fan group called the Harry Potter Association, which is one of the most radical fan activist groups. And when the second movie came out, and this became a huge blockbuster phenomenon, they organized an online campaign using the hashtag, odds in your favor, right? Because one of the things that they say when people go into the Hunger Games to compete, these young kids are forced to compete, they always say, may the odds be in your favor. And of course, they're never in your favor, right? Because it's 24, like 1 in 24. So this campaign was about getting people who knew the story to contribute their own stories about life under the brutal conditions of global capitalism and share them together with a selfie where they made the three fingers salute from Panem, right? Which is in the story, it's the symbol of political resistance to political power. So again, it's an example where fans actually take something from this text, where if you do a literary analysis of the text, you're like, this is horrible, right? Because it betrays the very thing it supposedly stands for. But where fans can say, screw the ending, we can write our own ending, and we will. But we can take things from that, and it will resonate amongst a much bigger group of people because we can benefit from its visibility. So.
But I guess it's kind of the function of fan fiction in a way is to kind of provide those narratives and stories they feel almost cheated out of in some way. There's it nearly got there. I'm quite interested in what you're saying about when it has this, again, very, very radical end, suddenly it does kind of 360s. And why do you think that is? I know it might be quite an obvious question, but why do you think people kind of push these very, very hard radical narratives and then at the very last minute go, not so much, and then stop?
I think amongst... my answer would be that amongst writers and creative people working in high-stakes enterprises like Hollywood and the young adult publishing industry, these really big things, right? There is, what we might call a kind of common sense about what works and what doesn't in stories. And this common sense is, of course, just the product of many, many years of filmmaking and storytelling. And especially in the American tradition of storytelling, but I think generally in sort of the capitalist industry of storytelling as a for-profit business, we've seen literally centuries of stories in which centrist behavior is in the sense of not being terribly political, not being terribly radical, not being terribly involved, but simply competing with others to challenge, to sort of overcome your own, to win in the end, right? It's the basic, I think the basic novel, the first novel in the English language is Robinson Crusoe, and that story of a person being isolated from a social, political, and economic context and still succeeding on his own, right? That's the basic myth of capitalism, and that's the thing that we keep reproducing. So stories that are initially maybe about forging bonds with others, organizing collectively, and resisting against politics, right, or political power, they're not really a huge part of our cultural vocabulary. So I think that a lot of writers working in whatever industry, they tend to sort of retreat from that when writing something that they consider to be for a mainstream audience or something. But that one of the reasons why that is changing is because one of the things that digital culture has given us is the fact that fan fiction and other forms of cultural appropriation have become a much bigger part of our shared cultural environment. And therefore, the difference between what is canon, i.e. what is the real story, and what people do with it through memes and through fanfic and through fan art and those kinds of stuff, that's really transformed the way we deal with storytelling altogether. So if you look at a lot of big Hollywood movies these days, like the new Star Wars movies or the new Star Trek movies, they're basically like fan fiction in a way. They're just using the whole history of that thing to make up new things and to embellish and transform. So it's no longer this sense that the story is there. Instead, we get endless variations and a lot more freedom, I guess, in terms of cultural production.
Yeah, because it's kind of for the fans that the sort of episode 7, where it's and this person's here and this person's here, and people kind of commented that actually Rogue One, which is the offshoot, is the kind of almost truer Star Wars film in many ways.
We're talking about Star Wars now,
Sorry.
so get ready, right?
Because suddenly it had, like, obviously it's the missing piece of the puzzle that is in between sort of those films, but it had a very interesting and weird way, because everyone died, spoilers, the heroes die in the end. There's no heroism, it's like ultimate sacrifice. It's very different to...
No, I wrote a totally gung-ho, rah-rah, hooray piece for Rogue One. Rogue One is like it's like a Star Wars movie that's not an official it's an official Star Wars movie, but it's not part of the numbered saga for non-Star Wars people, right?
Six.
And it's interesting because in the Star Wars, like, even if you've never seen a Star Wars movie, which some people apparently haven't, you still get the sense that, like, it's about this mythical story in which good wins out over evil, and somehow good is always embodied in this, weirdly Aryan, blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid from the country, right? Luke Skywalker. And all his friends are white, except for one guy. There's one, and they're all men, except for one girl, right? So you get this, there's this Star Wars tradition that is very man-centric, very white-centric, that has kind of taken over, in a way, the canon. So in Rogue One, to have a group of revolutionary rebels, right, none of whom are white, except for their leader, who's a woman, all sacrifice their lives in order to fight white supremacy, which is how, and neo-fascism, which is in the new movie how the enemy is coded. To do that in 2016, that's pretty interesting for a Hollywood movie to do, to say, like, actually people fighting protesting political power, they're doing that at great personal risk and often at great personal cost and sacrifice, and the people doing it are not white kids, that's because they're not the ones imperiled. So, yeah.
So we want to bring it back a little bit to Haunted Machines. We could go down Star Wars all day.
All day,
Forever. So one of the reasons why we've been looking in researching this at film and TV and stuff is the idea of the culture of expectation that's built up around TV. And we talked a bit about Star Trek over lunch and the expectations of technologies and the way they'll be that are built up through science fiction. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think... we're in an interesting phase now. The technology that we now all have, right, that we carry around in our pocket, that's the stuff that a generation and a half or maybe 2 generations ago, that was all science fiction, right? To be able to walk around with this power, the incredible power of technology, you can find all the knowledge in the world, except the stuff you got to pay for, that's paywalled. You can get it all on your phone all the time, right? And it goes up into space and everything, right? That's what Star Trek sort of promised us, and the Jetsons and all this modernist influenced science fiction. I remember a point when one of the Mission Impossible movies came out. I think it was Mission Impossible 4. Tom Cruise movies, right? Well, we're up to 6 now. But Mission Impossible 4, the Impossible Missions Force, right, which is the super spies who do incredible, crazy shit. They always had this amazing technology that they used. But the technology in the old TV show from the 1960s and all the movies so far was like generic, right? It was government issued, right? Secret technology. In Mission Impossible 4, they were using iPads and iPhones to do all the magical stuff that they did. And it felt so, it felt like sad to me in a way, right? Because it's like a recognition that all the promises of amazing technology that would transform our lives and create this kind of utopia in the way that Star Trek, because Star Trek had this connection between amazing technology that was there and free to use for everybody on board, I guess, right? Went hand in hand with a utopian future where poverty no longer existed, where racism no longer existed, where homophobia, I guess in theory didn't exist, but there also were no gay people on Star Trek. But anyway, right? But anyway, the promise of this future without any of the problems that we had. And now we're like, shit, this was 2012 or something. You get Tom Cruise using his iPad to do this. The Apple logo is there. They didn't even pay to be in the movie. They were just like, no, we want a technology that people can recognize and relate to. And you're like, shit, we're there, but all that other stuff hasn't happened. In fact, it's gotten worse, We're the difference between rich and poor and the conflict, and we're on the brink of nuclear war with North Korea today all of a sudden somehow. All that shit has just gotten worse, and Donald Trump is president. So it's like clearly there's a part of that dream that got disentangled from the more important part, where we get to celebrate the new revolutionary technology of the next, what is it now, the iPhone, not 8, but iPhone X, which is coming. That's going to be the next one. And that'll be awesome and exciting, so we don't pay any attention to all the other stuff that's going on.
Yeah, we were talking about this a bit with a friend last night about the brief, in the architectural context, the very brief post-war dream of like a socialist state-provided housing and home and sort of
social democracy.
Yeah, social democracy, and that Star Trek to me has always seemed somewhat a child of social democracy. There's also the kind of elements of colonialism, but everyone's united in this great mission of expanding human.
It is. It's weird though. Like I'm sorry, I've spent too much time thinking about Star Trek, clearly. But the interesting thing is you get like on the outside it says this is a utopian future where everybody gets to just pursue their dreams, et cetera, et cetera. But the stories you watch, right, are about the elite, like the corporate boardroom people, the captain and all his crew, who are hierarchically organized, who wear uniforms, they're hugely militaristic, and they're engaged in this kind of neo-colonialist exercise where you can have your colonialism, but not the pain and suffering that it historically brought with it, right? So it's kind of like trying to have your cake and eat it too. So in that sense, Star Trek really was never radical enough. Yeah. It sort of said, well, we can have all these things, but the form that it gave us that helped us bring it, or that articulated it to us, was still stuck in this whole several centuries Western idea of militarized colonialism. So it's not that surprising in that sense that if we were holding on to Star Trek as what the future ought to be or something, we didn't quite. Maybe we got too much of that too.
Well, I'm afraid for now that's the last you're going to hear from Dan.
Right, that's true.
But we are gonna invite you back at the end to have a discussion with all the other speakers. So that's super fascinating, and I wish we had more time than 15 minutes. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Dan.
See you later.
Okay, who's next? Because it says one thing here and one thing there. It is Simone. So next up is Simone Nikhil. Where are you? There you are. Come on up. Grab a microphone. Simone is a Swiss graphic designer and researcher based in Amsterdam. Her practice investigates the representation of identity without a body, the digitization of biomass, and the increasingly omnipresent optic gaze of everyday objects. Guess where I got this from? She has written a column on technology, body modification, and privacy for Sang Bleu, is part of design research collective Space Caviar in Genova, Italy, and is a tutor at the Architectural Association in London. And for IMPAKT, she's also been working on a new film, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a bit about your new film?
And you're showing another film, yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm glad we started off with Star Trek and pop culture. It's very good. Because this tends to be my sort of references for my work, and I can sympathize with the fact that you sort of feel like you have to justify why this is your frame of reference. But at the same time, why not? It's like the sort of all-encompassing media that you have around you. But so the film is called The Fragility of Life, and it is a portrait of a Hillary Clinton lookalike called Theresa Barnwell. And I went to visit her, this was 5 days before the elections in the US. She lives in California, and spent like a few days with her, sort of interviewing her about, her practice, what she does, also in anticipation of what the elections will do to her career. And I've also spent one evening with her, like the reality TV awards show in Hollywood, which was really weird. Because Donald Trump was one of the nominees for, what's the show called? The Apprentice. But then they invited her to sort of take on, or to get the award because he can't be there, yada yada. It was like this intense sort of play up of these personalities while, sort of the real election was going on at the same time. So I was interested in this strange symbiosis of, for one, media and how it was portrayed, but also two, sort of her being this replica within this sort of saturated moment of exposure already. So that the film kind of goes back and forth between her being 3D scanned and being yet another replica in like a 3D world, and her sort of answering my questions, upon which, yeah, there's really bizarre stories of like her being on a photo shoot with Julian Assange and stuff like that. But yeah, we shall see. Yes. Yeah.
So you've been working a lot with how bodies and the human form is kind of digitized and represented, right? And I remember you telling me this great story about how, is it Air Force data has been used by video game companies? Because when we talk about haunting, what we often mean is how decisions and things that have been done in the past are still hanging over in the way we're dealing with technology at the moment. And this is a particularly interesting case. I'm wondering if you could tell us about it.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, this has sort of been one of my questions, sort of trying to figure out specifically in 3D scanning and motion capture technology, what sort of drives this technology in terms of if you, for example, have to calibrate it to a real body, how does it recognize the real body? So, you know, at what point did some database tell the software that this is how a real body looks, so it can sort of automatically recognize it? And so sort of going into that wormhole of where did all of this come from, and all of this, you know, you'll never find like an all-encompassing answer, but you sort of find tidbits of research that is much older than the software you would use now, and realize, wait, this is sort of fueled into stuff that we use now but never has been questioned, because it probably was never thought to end up in, you know, that software, for example. And so, yeah, where to start with is one, this is where Star Trek comes in too. Star Trek was one, what was this, Voyage Home, the movie in, probably going to get it wrong, 70s? 80s. It's one of the first movies where Richard Nimoy was scanned, had a head scan. There's like this dream sequence of his head digitized, sort of swimming with a walrus. And that was one of the first moments when a human head was digitized, and so they needed a head scanner for this. So what was interesting is I was interested in this back and forth between Hollywood, the entertainment industry, and in this case, the military. Because at the same time, what the US Army wanted to do, later this was the Air Force, is make a survey of their personnel to have a database of body measurements so they could better design their cockpits, like masks, respirators, things like that. And so to do this, they used to do this manually, sort of, you know, sort of anthropometric measurements. You'd have like really rudimentary tools, sort of this, I don't know, like a sort of thing you stand in and then it measures your arm, etc. But they're like sort of wood and metal tools, like really basic essentially. But so the first time in 1988, in the study of 1988, what the US Army did is use a head scanner that took volumetric data of the head. And so this is sort of directly linked to this dream sequence in Star Trek and that company that made that head scanner. And this sort of carries on into the next survey, which also then was the first time a whole body scanner was developed. And this is the data that now sort of is used by a company that was just bought by Adobe for sort of assembly of 3D bodies, and so you can easily make avatars and sort of game characters. So it's a really strange sort of trajectory of, yeah, how this sort of, I guess, development of software isn't necessarily always questioned because it grows in a very different scale than what it might have been thought to be once it was a startup or like an academic research.
Yeah, so I know in a lot of your work you've kind of been analysing this gap, so I don't know if you could talk a bit more about how you actually start to assess where those gaps and those frictions and kind of start to arise that make you start to analyse the process a bit harder.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I still do see myself as a designer or like someone that makes. Because I sort of start with wanting to learn like a software, a technique, make a work, and like while doing that, sort of realize certain, like I develop questions within that process about the tools I'm using myself as well. So for example, this film, The Fragility of Life, I really started out with sort of a departure from facial recognition technology, which I've worked with quite a lot, to 3D scanning and motion capture. And so by doing that, sort of I didn't have access to the tools I really wanted to, so I started using this tool by Adobe, which I think in 2005, came out. It was called Mixamos. It was a startup from Stanford and then became its own company, and made it quite attainable to via sort of like a Frankenstein interface. You could choose heads and then torsos and legs, and then sort of step by step you could assemble this 3D body. And then afterwards it was fairly easy to animate this. So something that before was quite difficult and time consuming was suddenly sort of readily available. And so first I thought, well, this is awesome. But second, you were like, wait, why are there 5 bodies cut up? Who are these bodies? Like, how did they come to be? So I sort of start trying to investigate what this is. I'm using myself as well.
Yeah, so last year I saw what I think was probably the most fascinating artifact I've seen in a long time, which is a contract between Electronic Arts and FIFA, where FIFA agreed to start buying the data that Electronic Arts had gathered over like a decade of making football video games. And there's a couple of other things like this that have started to come up in recent times. There was a very famous clip of ITV News reporting on Syria having missiles that turned out to be from a video game. And I'm interested in where these rendering technologies and these abilities to render life accurately are starting to overtake reality. And this is something definitely we're looking at in the festival, is this idea of like the manufacturing of truthiness from rendering technologies that are better and better. Is that something you think about a bit in the way that you're working? Like when does a video game body become more idealized than like, the cover of Vogue or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I was interested in because of copyright. Like this came up with Teresa as well as the Hillary Clinton impersonator, as in, for example, I was really interested in getting a 3D scan of her, but the process I was also interested in, as in, do I have to sign a contract with her? Like, do I own the data? Does the company that scan her own the data? Because, I mean, for me, like the scene I use her for is pretty straightforward, but I mean, you could do anything with that for sure. And I mean, the scan I had made is not really realistic. It was also a question of money, of course, at that point, but it's not what technology could do now. You could do it much more realistically. But so I think this is where you sort of encounter these moments, because at the same time I was speaking to a motion capture actor who ends up doing a lot of what he called like Frankenstein technique as well, where he would lend his motion to like the face of, I don't know, Tom Cruise, whatever, that wants to be inserted into a game. And so I think sort of authenticity is an interesting question there, because he sort of talks about, how for him becomes really difficult to sort of act how the voice sounds. You become the character, but from a very different angle. It's not you read the script and I think this is what this act needs. It's much more, this is what the voice sounds like, and I'm gonna, try to personify that voice. And so I think there's just possibilities of sort of circumvent a lot of what we might, call like a truthful image, that it's actually quite difficult to talk about, because I mean, it is happening and it will happen, and I think how it's happening is actually what I'm interested in, as in, that it isn't as straightforward as I'm going to sort of take an image, whatever that is, and sort of reproduce it or multiply it, but that it's actually this sort of accumulation of different kind of data that then produces something very different that is then hard to question, because it isn't maybe so much about truth and or fiction and artificial anymore, but even if it's artificial, it can be truthful.
How does Teresa feel about her double?
Yeah.
I'd be interested, because I don't know how I'd feel if there was like a digital double of me, like body-wise.
Yeah, I mean, I was also kind of, I felt really weird asking her, because it felt really intimate, but she didn't mind at all. She was just super excited to be part of this technology, basically. And I also, I had it documented while she was being scanned, and she sort of walks into this rig and is like, okay, what are we doing? And they're like, oh, we're going to, sort of keep you for the future. And she's like, oh, this is so exciting. She's just really happy about the experience rather than thinking about the consequences, I guess. Yeah.
Did she kind of change her behaviour in the way that she was when she encountered it? Because obviously it's the same way that when you ask someone to take a photo, suddenly you straighten your back and you smile in a different way that perhaps you wouldn't if you were caught unawares. I guess that's another thing to consider, is how, not just how those behaviours change how we see ourselves, but also what happens when that result happens. And oh, actually, I didn't think that I stood like that, or I did that kind of thing. But
Yeah, I mean, with her it was interesting because I was much more interested in Teresa than in Hillary, and she would always give me Hillary. So the same with the scan, you know, it's like, well, you have to pose, so she can't. I mean, maybe she's so not used to it anymore after having done this for 30 years that she immediately starts posing as Hillary, you know, just kind of, like, I don't know, like that power stance. And so I think for her, I don't know, it feels like she puts a distance between the image and herself already. So she was a little bit weirded out by the fact that I could then change that pose. But somehow, like, I was much more worried for her than she was in the end. That, you know, now I could, I don't know, have her animated in XYZ way.
So I'm interested as well in how, when this possibility of sort of very accurate digital simulation becomes more and more present, there was a demo video released recently from a lab that they said they managed to make Obama say whatever they wanted, right? Because they could really accurately model his face. What kind of things might we set up or put in place or start to talk about or teach in order to make sure that we're not caught out unawares by, you know, fabrication of digital realities? Are there things we could do, or are we just going to be fooled a lot, do you think? Probably fooled a lot.
Good hygiene, like how not to be accidentally captured, that kind of thing, or
Yeah.
Hygiene for capture.
But I mean, like, you know how the whole thing about like internet, when you try and teach children, actually the biggest issue is around sort of like consent and knowing what you're doing on the internet and that kind of thing. And if we are becoming that into that sort of sphere where you are, how do you sort of, I don't know, verify yourself and make sure that you're not like seen as doing something that you wouldn't do? Like, how would you, I don't know, thinking very speculatively here, like a watermark for your body.
Could you watermark a body?
Yeah. You got tattoos. We've got tattoos.
Because you did that at the project that you exhibited at the New Institute, which was trying to hide a body by putting so many faces on a T-shirt that facial recognition couldn't capture it, right?
Brittany.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. This is where the sort of the look-alike obsession comes from facial recognition technology. I'm sort of speculating that you could wear a T-shirt that looks like a really strange version of a fan shirt with tons of, for example, Michael Jackson faces.
Can you bring it up? We are going to try and live Google things so we can try and show you things.
So we can actually get this up.
Let's see if we can do it.
So the T-shirt, so it sort of fools the machine as well as the sort of human eye, in that, like, you do think whatever, it's Michael Jackson, etc. But in reality, it's all look-alike, so none of it is the real person.
Yeah. But I guess that whole of, like, making yourself, it's the interesting thing when you have these sort of technologies that try to cheat facial weaponization, sort of facial recognition, is that in trying to fool the machines, you make yourself incredibly obvious to other people that aren't machines, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, it was a question of what technology you're looking at too, because at the same time I was interested in, this was part of this project as well, like a makeup that was designed for film cameras, for high definition film cameras. And this is white powder, that's white silicon powder. And once you put it on, you don't see it, but you'd use it to sort of highlight certain parts of your face. And the interesting thing was that once you use it for film, it just gives you a little bit of a glow in certain areas of your face. But once you use it, so then stars started using it on the red carpet, and once you take a photo, specifically with flash, it reflects the light completely differently, and it reveals these sort of markings. And so, like, maybe you can find a photo of this.
Is it called HDR makeup?
Yeah, or you can find something like
So you get kind of weird. I've seen a lot of adverts for like Instagram ready skin. So it's things where you where you can do makeup or do things so that you become better.
Right.
No.
That's also beautiful. Makeup fail. Yeah, exactly. Makeup fail is a good one.
Makeup film.
Fail. And
Makeup
who had it? Yeah. I think Nicole Kidman.
This is a very serious event.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, wow. Also, yeah, this is just what we're talking about.
Great. I guess we'll have to leave that for when we got more astute research. I know we're running out of time, so we've got time for one last question or comment. Anyone got any questions? Quick question?
No.
Here.
That's all right.
Where am I? What is this?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much, Simone. We'll have you back shortly.
Oh, some interesting looks there.
The unpredictability of Google.
Yeah.
Gives us this. All right. So our final guest before a quick break is Dr. Edwin Akintola Hubbard. He is another assistant professor in media and cultural studies at Utrecht University. They're everywhere. He has been an award-winning investigative journalist, news reporter, and television producer. Has worked as an artist, promotion for Loose Africa Records, and conducts an experimental ethnography workshop, which I believe you want to talk about a bit. So far in the US, China, and Brazil, that merges ethnographic research methods and art practice. Welcome, Akin.
Whoa.
Busy man, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. Thanks, and thank you, everybody. Okay, I don't know how organized this is all going to be because it might be all over the place, but I'm trying today to perhaps just maybe talk a little bit about my work, my thinking, I guess, around the work, but hopefully in a way that can be helpful to your theme and to your. Actually, let me just grab my laptop.
No, it's fine. Again, it's very casual here. It's
Okay,
good.
so-
Keeping it loose.
And where do I start? Should I talk about my?
Yeah, we talked very briefly about your experimental ethnography workshop.
Sure.
I'd be interested to hear more.
Okay, all right. That I wasn't really prepared to talk about that, but okay. This is a little bit about my background to give you a sense of where I'm coming from here. Well, I'm a trained anthropologist. That's what I did my PhD in, and my dissertation was actually on the Cape Verde Islands, which are a group of, it's a very tiny archipelago of 9 inhabited islands off the coast of West Africa. I lived there for over 3 years, so my research kind of went through several phases while I was there, but I ended up doing a dissertation on music and globalization, so we could forget about that for the time being. And, but my initial project when I went to Cape Verde, and this is more than 10 years ago, we're talking about 2004, was my first sort of preliminary research trip. But I went with the initial idea to study the Gothic in Cape Verde from an anthropological perspective as an ethnographer, which isn't very, it's not a very straightforward topic at all, and I had hell's bells defending it. But my initial topic was to study the Gothic, because I was very interested in this island in the south of the Cape Verde archipelago called Fogo. And Fogo is actually Portuguese for fire, the word fire. And that's because the entire island is one massive stratovolcano, an active stratovolcano. And in fact, inside the crater of the caldera of this stratovolcano, there's actually a town. And this town has a town with vineyards and with a church and with post offices and so on and so forth. But aside from that, this island in Cape Verde has a very deep culture, and I call it a culture of suicide, which was sort of like the sociological study I was very interested in. But looking just at what was this thing that connected to or gave birth to or motivated this culture of suicide. So, but then I was really, I went through Durkheim, I went through all the sort of usual sources you would think of as a social scientist, but I was much more interested in the aesthetics of Fogo, and I was interested in perhaps how the aesthetic dimension of this space, of this cultural space, actually, produced these kinds of these cultural forms. And I did see suicide as a kind of cultural form, not just because people did it all the time, but I'm sorry if I sound really morbid about this, and I've lost people to suicide myself, so I don't mean to make light of this. But what I saw in Fogo was a lot of storytelling about suicide. A lot of suicide became a kind of active element in society. It was something, it was a warning, it was a narrative, it was there, and also too, it was always somehow projected into aesthetic form. But aside from that, I felt that looking at this island and the very concept of living in an active volcano, which actually erupted 2 years ago, that was the last eruption. And yes, every time the volcano erupts, the entire town has to move out of the caldera, etc., etc. But what is interesting is that the very notion of living on an active or in an active volcano is itself kind of suicidal, right? So there are those things to sort of consider or those were the things I was considering when I approached this first, to kind of perhaps plot some sort of some sort of Gothic apparatus by which this place, Cape Verde, operates and sort of presents itself to the world. But aside from that, there are other reasons that drew me to it. I think maybe more ironically, I'm interested in anthropology, my own discipline. I'm interested in critiquing my own discipline in certain respects, and I think that the anthropologist is himself a kind of Gothic figure. I think in Western culture, the anthropologist is the scientist of the other. Okay, the anthropologist always is a kind of intermediary between science and superstition, or the arcane tradition and modern knowledge. So in a sense, I think my own role as an ethnographer is already kind of Gothicized. I already kind of step into this field, as a kind of Gothic figure myself. So that was part of what led me to this. But I think. Overall, my theoretical point of entry here was actually race. I was very interested in looking at blackness in mixed race societies, or what we might call in anthropology Creole societies, or Creolized cultures in which there's a high degree of racial and ethnic and cultural mixing. But I was interested in looking at how blackness itself becomes monstrous in most mixed race contexts. And I mean everywhere from Latin America to Africa, even to Asia, where there's a huge skin lightening industry right now, these skin lightening cosmetics, which I also link to this notion of blackness as the abject, or blackness as monstrous. So my interest in Cape Verde had everything to do with this question of how to think of race within this kind of aesthetic economy. How is it that we think about, how is it that blackness and black people and black things become consistently treated as the Gothic or Gothicized in some ways? And of course, you can see where I'm going with this in terms of how we think about monsters vis-a-vis immigration, vis-a-vis all these other issues in society. Anyway. How do I tie all of this up? How do I bring all of this into the picture? Is right now I'm interested in what I call an aesthetic excavation of this island, and I plan to be doing this with an artist friend and a musician friend. But the idea is we are trying to approach this as a kind of archaeological dig, as a kind of archaeological excavation, but of course aesthetic. And a lot of this is trying to capture these Gothic strains of life in this place. How much time do I have left?
Keep going.
Okay, good.
It's a good story.
It's on the 5-minute rule, so you're fine.
Good. Okay, so how do I link all of this to the theme of haunted machines and wicked problems? Well, no, it's not. I wouldn't say it's that hard at all. It's not hard at all. I think the way I would approach this, and I think actually when I heard the theme, I started thinking of things to talk about today, and I came up with all these crazy ideas. But I started to think of, okay, what are the obvious sort of haunted machines that I can think of, and of course Frankenstein is the obvious one. But I also thought of, did anyone see 2001: A Space Odyssey? Right, HAL. Okay, I thought of HAL, the recalcitrant computer on board the ship that essentially, destroys everybody, and But I don't know. About a few weeks ago, actually, there was also an incident which I don't know if you could bring up online. But there was an article about Facebook. Did you hear about this? Facebook having to shut down these two computers that started talking to each other by themselves. And so, right, exactly. You don't have to bring it up. Everybody knows. So these are all some of the examples I tried to come up with. Yeah. Right, and I mean Well, that wasn't the article I was reading about this, but this article kept talking about people just talking about, oh my God, these machines, oh my God, these machines, this is frightening, but I mean, this is a common theme, I guess, in Western civilization. It's that the idea that, and I think you guys in your statement made that very clear, that Gothic tropes typically are about anxiety. And it's either anxiety about the past, about the present, or about the future. And I think that for me, the haunted machine is all about the anxiety. The anxiety is associated with innovation. It's technological innovation that scares the shit out of us. And therefore, what does that mean? And I think you guys suggested that it's both fear as well as possibility, and that's true. But how would I bring this into my own schema is that I actually, and it's not me, but a Cuban cultural and literary critic named Antonio Benitez Rojo came up with the idea that the plantation itself, the plantation which produced, the colonial moment, the plantation itself which produced slavery, the plantation which produced what we call the New World in a sense, was a machine. In fact, it is a machine. So I'm not making this up, right? But Benitez Rojo's argument is that this is one of history's greatest machines, the plantation system. And of course, the plantation system is what produced, as I said, Creole societies and Creole cultures, these mixed race societies in which, descendants of European colonizers, formed societies with the descendants of the people they enslaved and colonized. But insofar as the plantation itself is a machine, and this is no sort of recent idea. I think I was mentioning to you that structural functionalist theory has seen society as an organism, but so it's not far-fetched to think of society or social systems as machines. And I guess where I end up on this is, what would it mean for a social system like a plantation to be haunted? And in fact, I think that that's exactly what I'm looking at in the context of Cape Verde. Because when you're looking at a Gothic post-colonial site, you're looking at the ruins of slave plantations. You're looking at buried traumas. You're looking at all kinds of suffused and sublimated memories, etc., etc. So. And of course, you're looking at a whole history of cruelty and narratives associated with these things. So my argument is that the Gothic today in Cape Verde, in a place like Fogo, is very much part of this haunted machine we're talking about. It is a machine, and it continues producing Gothic realities. Okay, I guess the last thing I will throw on top of that is hopefully approaching a social system in this way, approaching social systems as if they can be haunted, is interesting to me because I think it helps me to think, for instance, about things like democracy, for example. Can democracy be haunted? Can we speak of a haunted democracy? And I think a lot about last year, those world historical moments that came last year, Brexit and the US elections. It turned everybody's world upside down. But I think about all the press and the reactions I heard about that. And, even now, Fareed Zakaria and all these commentators keep talking about, democracy gone wrong. Democracy, what's wrong with our democracy? What went wrong? And I keep thinking again about this idea it makes me think a lot about this haunted machine, this idea that maybe we've conceived of democracy as a thing that works, according to our commands. And it works according to the way we envision the world and want social relations to actually happen. But then what happens when democracies become recalcitrant? And I think the last thing I will say about that is Fareed Zakaria's argument that what we're witnessing in the world today is the rise of illiberal democracy, which might be where we're going with this in terms of looking at how machines malfunction. That, is illiberalism the malfunctioning of our democratic moment? Is this the undoing of this democratic machine, this democratic system that we've been relying on for so long, or we think we've been relying on for so long?
Yeah, I've got there's lots of things there. It's great. We actually have run out of time, I think.
Really?
Have we?
Well, I think
I've got 2 minutes, yeah.
I think there is an important point to be made there about something that is a very contemporary thing, which is the if not the actual, then the kind of in the mind mechanization of everything. That everything is a form of machine. The city, the polis, the government, the sort of hangover of cybernetics into contemporary world.
Ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. In the zero-sum game that all these systems are ultimately are supposed to provide for us. And that does raise the question of when those systems are so large and so complex, and we're told that they are computers, they have inputs and outputs, we set the variables right. When they do go wrong, we do start thinking that they're haunted, or that they are also haunted by their histories, because democracy didn't appear in 1946. It appeared in, from the late 1700s onwards, and it's an interesting thing of how we allot when these massive systems go wrong. We sort of give them supernatural qualities as a way of dehumanizing them and perhaps evading responsibility, I suppose.
It also does that interesting thing of making monsters of people who shouldn't be in many ways, whereas they kind of the involuntary ghosts that arise from when those machines start to break down. So again, you kind of mentioning about the idea of the other, and you see it a lot with contemporary technology where people are made monsters by technology that doesn't understand that they should exist in that. So you might have all seen that the hand washer where the white person puts their hand under and the green light hits it and the soap comes out, but when his black colleague puts his hand underneath, it just doesn't work. And suddenly that body doesn't have the same impact that other bodies have. And so legibility and visibility, but it makes an involuntary monster of those particular personalities. So what entities? But yeah, there's lots there. Anyone got any questions for Akin? Oh, the first question. It's good.
Do you want to shout onto the mic? Or I can just speak up a bit.
You can hear your voice then.
You have to give your name and address as well.
Yeah.
Hello, Alspont here, but no worries there. Address, you can get it later. My question is, how do you... I read this summer the book about quantum leadership, and they say like the Western world is really thinking in machine ways of thinking, and the Eastern way is more looking at it like an ocean with waves. Could that be quite interesting? Because everything I heard is quite a Western perspective, scientifically Western perspective. So how would the Asian way of thinking fit into this?
Okay, well, first of all, what you've heard so far is a Western perspective on thinking. Could you please explain? I don't know if you can. Let me get it. I'm not sure.
Oh, thank God, it was a book of 500 pages. How do you explain that quite easily? We in the West, we tend to put everything in boxes. We see everything in a machine, like everything is a reaction to something else. Where in the Asian way, it's more in relations. So we think in interactions in the West, and they think more in relations.
Right, I see. Well, I think also, there's been the recognition of things like what you're talking about. That it is probably a Western way of thinking to kind of imagine things as being, separate, discrete elements working together in a mechanistic way. But yes, I think that I'm not saying that's the only way to see functioning systems, because I believe that things like flow, for example, which is a concept I think much closer to what you're talking about. The idea that certain kinds of systems are connected by way of flow and energy, etc. In terms of as a way out of these kinds of machine metaphors, but. At the same time, I feel that the machine itself is I hate to use this word, but is so universal. And I'm not suggesting that this is my way or my suggestion that we should sort of impose some sort of Western paradigm on the rest of the world. But I don't know that a machine is something that only Westerners have thought of or thought with. I am willing. I think all these other metaphors are also helpful, but I think that for all kinds of reasons, in my case at least, I think the machine is something that I really want to use in my work to talk about these particular forces of history, because they were mechanistic. It was about the history of mechanization in my case. In the case of at least the post-colonial world, I would say probably all of Africa, pretty much all of Asia, pretty much all of Latin America. So this is about the history of mechanization. I don't know that a metaphor of water or flow would necessarily be helpful for me right now. Right? You think so? No. Well, we can definitely talk, and I think as I've heard lots of interesting commentary about things like the sea and the role of the ocean in this or as a way to sort of map all of these kinds of connections as opposed to mechanistic connections. But we can talk after. Sorry.
Yeah, we do have a break.
All right.
So, yeah.
We have a saved this because we have a discussion at the end with all the guests so far. We're going to have a break now until 3:15, so about 13 minutes, and then we're going to have our final guest, Rainer Hoffman, and chat to him briefly, and then we're going to have everybody back, and we're all going to talk about Game of Thrones and other more serious business.
I've never seen it. I don't know what to say.
Thank you to our 3 guests.
Thank you again. And we're back.
I like that more and more every time I see it. Okay, so we've got one more guest to get up for a bit of a Q&A, and then we're going to have, for a bit of a discussion, then we're going to have a bit more of an open discussion with Simone and Dan and Ekin coming back. And then after that, we're going to wander over to the Spielclock Museum and see some creepy stuff.
It's creepy.
And then we're going to go to the pub.
Rabbit cabbage.
There's also, at 8 p.m. at the City Hall Square, we're also doing... 8:30 p.m. at the City Hall Square. We're also doing an advanced screening of one of the films we've got featured in part of the screening program for the October part of the festival. And we're going to be showing, Arjen is going to be introducing and showing Simone Rabadango's Teacher of Algorithms, which is a really interesting short design fiction / science fiction film about a kind of backstreet trainer of automatic smart machines. It's really good. It's very funny, and it's very interesting, it's very informative, and hopefully it'll lead to some interesting discussion afterwards. So let's welcome up our next guest. It's Rainer Hoffman. Come on up, grab a mic.
The artistic director of Spring in Utrecht.
Yeah, Rainer is the artistic director of Spring Festival. We have the Spring and Autumn Festival coming up the 19th
to 21st of October.
And as part of Spring and Autumn and IMPAKT, we are co-presenting a version of Phobia-orama by Dries Verhoeven, and we've got a short video to show. Could we start with the video, or do you want to introduce the project a bit first?
Maybe I say just a few words about Spring and Autumn. Spring is an international performing arts festival showing contemporary interdisciplinary work, and as the name says, it happens in spring, and as the name Spring and Autumn says, there's a second edition Spring and Autumn. And we are glad to have this cooperation with IMPAKT Festival, and we asked Arjen and the curators if they would be interested to co-present the work of Dries Verhoeven. Dries Verhoeven is an artist we've been working with for a long time. He does a lot of work in public space, and did quite some use some technology in some of his work. And maybe if you don't mind, I can tell a few words what performing arts does with technology, or how this goes together, because basically you might think it's live audience and performers in the same space, so basically the opposite as what social media does. But performing arts sort of always incorporated everything from video to all sound systems that have been developed. And so it started also to work with technologies. So there are people working like with VR glasses and 360 degrees film. I also read an article recently that said that 360 degree film has much more to do with theater than with film, because film is always about framing and directing your gaze, and in theater you're free to look. And film directors who worked with 360 degree film started, oh god, I cannot frame it, I have to sort of film the whole space that I have. I'm at the moment also co-producing a production with a Korean artist, Chisen Kim, and she it's called A Deep Present, and it's about outsourcing things to algorithms. And she writes a text together with 4 writing algorithms. And she has then 4 machines on stage. One is the Hell, which was mentioned before, from 2001. One is a Buddha from Nam Yune Paik work. One is actually a writing machine, and the 4th I don't remember. Yeah, the 4th is a Sony little robot. So, and she tries to write with these 4 things who got algorithms allocated to them, a performance, and she performs with them. It's still unclear if she's on it or not. So the theater is sort of kind of incorporating all sorts of technology and experimenting with it, but it's probably, I think, very much in the beginning. It's still kind of a meeting process. And Dries Verhoeven, maybe we show the trailer now, and then we talk about the project a bit.
Yeah. So it's this one, yeah?
Bottom one, yeah.
Yeah. Let's make it big.
annoyingly not buffered the whole way.
It is clear that the threat from ISIL is evolving. Last night's attack suggests a new degree of planning and coordination, and a greater ambition for mass casualty attacks. The terrorist aim is clear. It is to divide us and to destroy our way of life. So more than ever, we must come together and stand united and carry on the way of life that we love and that we know and that will never be moved off. Your values are our values. Your pain is our pain. Your fight is our fight.
Cheerful?
Upbeat, yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this performance piece, this installation?
Well, the only thing that you have seen here that you will see in the performance is actually this guy in the end. The rest of it is not on stage or so. There is also no stage. It's a haunted house. You know, one of these fairground attractions where people sit in little carts and go through the dark and then some skeleton comes up. So that's the basic setup of the whole performance. So it's an audience of 20 in 10 cars, but there is not one of the usual ghosts that we meet there. But we hear we see some screens, but we can hardly see anything on the screens. And we hear speeches. And it goes from Trump to Geert Wilders. He always making a national version, depending on which country Dries is presenting that work. And it's all about a kind of an excursion into the culture of fear and populism. As we know, media were always very important to dictators of populist politicians, from Nazis who had a big film industry to wherever. And I think sort of the kind of populism that is active today needs fast communication, otherwise it doesn't work. It couldn't spread so fast around the usual or the established media channels. And I think about this fear of culture that is what Dries is working about. So you have kind of an experience where you run for 40 minutes forwards, backwards, and you see some of these guys that you have seen there. You see some animals and hear some animals, and it focuses more and more actually on this culture of fear, and mainly on the fear from people coming from somewhere else, refugees or whatever. It had quite an enormous impact in Athens, where it premiered. They put the big tent where it's in front of the parliament in Athens, which is kind of the place where demonstrations happen in Athens. And then it was a Holland Festival, and now it comes to Utrecht here. So that's basically the performance we're going to see. It's quite an impressive thing coming really close, because it also asks you, do we really believe that? I mean, this kind of suspense of disbelief, because you know it's a performance, but you kind of tend to get very much into it. Maybe we are also here, Dries says maybe our fear is not strong enough yet. Maybe have to learn to fear more even.
So me and Tobias had a little kind of mini go on it. We went to go and see Dries a little while ago, and I think the thing that was really interesting is that kind of the rhetoric that actually kind of goes through it. So you kind of notice that it's not just the traditional bad guys that are shown to have the sort of the rhetorical exercises of sort of fear, but actually the people who are supposedly sort of good or often lauded as good, so JFK and that kind of thing, and the way that kind of political narratives come about. And I was wondering actually how easily people recognise that, because they're always so easy to jump for the monster. Actually, how do people then kind of start unbuttoning where there's the techniques of the monsters are used by other people as well?
I mean, I think it starts pretty broad with something like also fear of climate change. So it's not like, oh, it's only the left wings are afraid of the right wings, or the left wings say the right wings are to blame for creating fear. But it starts pretty far in the way he sort of analyzes the rhetorics of fear from different sides. And then it focuses more and more. I think it's not really... he has quite a neutral stance towards technology, I think, because it's kind of pretty old-fashioned with screens and bad sounds, and you hear the speeches half, but not really, and then it gets a little bit more clearer. So it has a bit of a low-tech feeling to it, even. So he's not really blaming anything, but he really delivers quite an interesting experience in the end.
Well,
I think he's really playing with the kind of, for want of a better word, the tackiness of like the fairground, right? It's not slick and it's not perfect, and there are loads of gaps, and you can see the workings of it in the tracks and the cabling and stuff like that, which I think is really interesting to sort of play with that trope knowingly, because you know what you're getting in for, but then also at the same time it's contextualized differently, because it's not ghosts and ghouls, it's speeches from David Cameron, as we heard there, or Geert Wilders, whoever it is.
I mean, sort of, I think it's very much about we go to these attractions because we like fear. We go to horror movies because we like the threat we get there. And I think it's on that, so the attraction of fear, the attraction of horror that we feel. At the same time, if you use that politically, it can get dangerous. And I think he shows a bit that kind of fascination and how it can be used for political purposes.
what the sort of general sort of audience, like what do audience talk about the most when they come out of the work?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think it's very diverse. I think some people really felt frightened. I mean, they also have a security system that you can raise your hands and somebody sees you and they will stop the machine to get out if you're really claustrophobic or frightened or something like that. But I think mostly it's then really about populism. But of course, there's always the question: don't we agree anything on what is bad about populism and those people who go into these performances?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what the effect it has on the Netherlands now. When we last saw it, you were on the edge of an election that could have gone the wrong way, but now everyone's feeling a bit more secure with Macron. So I'm going to be interested to see how the Dutch audience react to it. Because that's perhaps the reason why we ended up here in the first place with Trump and Brexit, is just the complacency. You know, the fear became just a spectacle and a fantasy and not something that was visceral and real. And I think it's nice to do a piece that reminds you that it has a real effect.
But also that kind of fear that bubbles under the surface and the things that we didn't, because they aren't immediately seen. So things with Trump, for instance, we didn't see the level of which people who had those views and shared them until the last minute, and they kind of came up through this election and became empowered to do it. So it's almost that sort of like the kind of the resonant frequency below what we think we see. And actually, it takes the right trigger or a certain thing to suddenly open that up. And I don't know, I guess with Dries' work, he's trying to explore that a little bit, and because that idea of like tension, because obviously it's a big theatrical and dramatic device, the idea of tension, and is it unheimlich, like Brecht's idea of like you constantly not feeling certain. It's quite a known theatrical technique, so I guess this is a new version of poking at that.
Yeah, I think it's very important that it's also in public space, that it's not in the theater space that you can see outside. It's a tent there, that it has this fairground feeling, that it has this sort of popular, accessible for everybody idea, and that it's not like high culture or anything, that he mixes these things between high and low culture. And I think this reference is very important. That's why it can have a very direct impact. So I hope we get some people who would usually not go to the Stadschouwburg there, but who feel attracted by this kind of setting that you see from the outside.
Have you been in it?
I've been in it, yeah.
Well, what did you think? How did you feel? How did you feel afterwards?
I mean, I'm professionally totally spoiled. So because I only think then about the mechanisms in there, or how he does what he does. I think I lost a bit my naive gaze on it in a way.
Does it ever get framed as a kind of performance activism, like in the sense that you are making something that is not high performance art? It's not in a gallery somewhere at the edge of the city. It's something that's it's outside. It's in Syntagma, or it's in this case it's outside the city hall as well, I think. Does he ever think about it that way, as a kind of performance activism?
I mean, he made a very conscious choice a couple of years ago to not work in theater spaces anymore, but do installations either in public space or put something in public space to have a more direct impact, but also to confront a different sort of audience. So not those who are willing to pay like 25 euros for a show, but sort of anybody who passes by. I mean, in this case, you still have to pay something, but a lot of the work he does is just there, and you can relate to it. So without paying an entrance fee. In this case, it's too big for not paying an entrance fee. Yeah.
We should also mention that Dries will be joining us at a panel at IMPAKT as well on the Thursday. Well, we'll release the schedule properly, but he'll be joining us a bit more to talk about the kind of research behind it as well, particularly in that notion sort of with post-truth and that kind of thing.
And also by that point when it's open, it'll be interesting to see how publics have responded to it, you know. At the moment we're sort of speculating. All right. Thank you very much, Raina. Stay on stage.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Stay on.
There are some flyers back there.
Yep.
Yeah, these very bold, interesting, and terrifying
Spring
postcards
autumn's
as
up.
well. Yeah.
I'd like to invite back our 3 guests from earlier to all return.
So, Akin, Simone, and Dan.
Oh, yes, that's why it says discussion. Thank you. Hello. Shall I shuffle over? Yeah, shuffle over one. Go on. Someone else can sit. Simone, do you want to sit? All right, so we've got everybody back together. And we've heard a little bit about what everyone's up to. We've heard stuff about facial recognition and body mapping and Teresa, the Hillary impersonator. We've had Phobia Rama, Dries Verhoeven's installation and the use of performance to talk about fear and apprehension. We've had Dan and the reflection of science fiction and fantasy and political stuff. That political gumph, no one knows what it's really about. And then Akin's work with this sort of cultural object of suicide and the machine of democracy and whether it's haunted. Before we crack into a discussion about Game of Thrones, are there any questions from? Are there any questions from any of the audience at all? You've been sat around patiently for an hour and a half or so. No? All right. So.
It's up to you. Yeah, I'm going to let you take the first one, Tobias.
I don't want to go to Game of Thrones. I want to talk about Star Trek. So, what's been really...
Alien, please.
So what's been really common, I think, throughout is this recognition that pop culture and science fiction and the stories we tell, whether they're in performance or whether they're in film or TV, have an effect over how we interrogate and think about media and technologies. And I'm interested in if anybody here thinks that there's something we can do to more actively engage these stories and these myths and these narratives for positive change, not to just become victim to them. We talked briefly about the Hunger Games as perhaps a counter-narrative, but not everybody's got the millions of dollars sat around maybe to make it. But then we've got things like fan fiction that might provide a way of creating an activist narrative, maybe.
Yeah, I guess the thing, kind of the ultimate utopias and ultimate dystopias, how helpful they're not, and actually, yeah.
I mean, that's a really hard question to answer in an optimistic way for me right now. I'm sorry, but it's because, I mean, to me, the biggest problem in overcoming that hurdle, in actually changing the conversation about technology to transform it into a more radical, progressive direction, is the fact that the platforms that we have are themselves for-profit corporations. I mean, there used to be a dream, right, in the 1980s of the internet, right, of what the internet could be, that it could be this incredible commons where everything was free and information flowed freely, and through processes of mutual communication and creative collaboration, we would arrive in a kind of techno-utopia. And of course, what we're seeing right now is the rapid and seemingly unstoppable incorporation of all of those spaces. So if you're so the depressing thing is that no matter how progressive or radical the stuff is that you're posting on Twitter and Tumblr and Facebook, you're actually providing content for the biggest media platforms of our age, right? If I ask my students, first-year media studies students, like, what is the biggest media company that exists today? They'll say, Disney, or and they're not far off, right? Or Time Warner, or Endemol, or these other things. Like, it takes them a while to understand. Like, no, Facebook is the biggest, most widely used media platform, but like all the other sharing economy bullshit businesses like Uber and Deliveroo and all of those things, they don't produce anything themselves. But they shape what we produce and how we interact with it through technology, right? So liking things, sharing things, retweeting things, etc., favoriting things, those become limitations upon what we can do and how we can interact with it. And that to me is and that's one of the things that tends to polarize and depoliticize and make it much more difficult to actually organize, because it keeps you stuck within certain algorithms, filter bubbles, and stuff like that. So that I think is the biggest hurdle to overcome. A good book about that is Platform Capitalism by Nick Cernicek, which came out recently about this very problem.
Well, there's also been a lot of stuff, I suppose, about the fact that whether it's Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, they're linear. So unlike the dream of the internet, which was a rhizomatic network where things would link and you would spread and thus new knowledge could be produced, you're stuck in a linear, literally physically and sort of content-wise scrolling platform, right, where it's a stream instead of this network, which I guess destroys the ability for radical political action if you can't move outside of that stream in the first place and spread ideas.
Yeah.
But I mean, it has to do a lot with monopolization of certain sectors, not only in technology. If you've only 2 or 3 big ones over, then this democratic idea is also over. And I think that's a political question, then how to avoid through laws or whatever that only 3 big ones can share the market.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I was only going to say, I think it's also, I mean, this is quite an obvious comment, but something that I realized also within my work, you sort of tend to forget. So not only, that you have certain platforms that sort of govern visibility in that sense, but also how they function. So the linearity, I think, also comes from how it's built, and in that, speaking about identity, for example, to be able to sort of know who said what and sort of attach value to that. So to be able to collect likes, whatever it be, the system is designed to only give you one way to express yourself. And I always have to think of sort of John Perry Barlow's way of describing the internet in the Declaration of Independence for Cyberspace, where he says that that's a space where bodies don't live. And I think it's something that sounds really utopian, and by now we've sort of forgotten. And you think, no, to have it function, you need to have order over like a standard, a sort of canon. And one of those things is that you need to have an identity, and it's linked through certain platforms or all platforms. And this goes sort of down to biometric identification, the fact that you unlock your iPhone with a fingerprint, etc., so that it's you. And sort of that, I think, sense of security that gives you is also really hindering in actually creating any other narrative than the one that's created for you by just being on those platforms. So it's not only just like content you produce, it's also a lot of times produced passively by you. And in that sense, I think it's really hard to act then within that. Yeah.
So one of the artists involved in the program, Peter Musgaard, has found a way to kind of actively reject this by using Tumblr solely as his platform, right? So everything is disattributed. So he puts his own work up there as well as other people's work. He doesn't attribute any of it. There's no kind of trace or knowledge of who he is and what he's done. And he talks, and we did a video interview a few weeks back about, he frames this as cargo culting, right? He's saying that there's no original stuff truly, or you're duplicating anyway. And so the idea of attaching your name and identity, or even trying to hold on to one in digital culture, is completely useless. There's no point. So he's just completely given it up, which I find is a really interesting strategy. But then, of course, it's very hard for him to claim credit for that strategy because his name's not written down anywhere on the work, Any other thoughts on this idea of like digital identity and platforming?
Well, I think like one thing that nobody really saw coming, even within the limitations of those platforms, is the role that artificial intelligence now plays within it. And if you see that, like, one of the most politically charged online spaces now, of course, is Twitter, which is like a constant battlefield. But I read yesterday, like they they'd inventoried Donald Trump's followers on Twitter, and only 46% of them are actual people, and the rest are all automated bots that constantly respond to anybody responding to the Donald Trump Twitter account with alt-right propaganda, with whatever kind of dissemination, and creating these flurries of debates where people are basically just responding to computers spewing out political propaganda from all kinds of varieties. So, talking about haunted machines, I mean, this seems like a really weird way in which that kind of digital space has indeed become haunted by a variety of different types of voices.
And who's running the bots?
You tell me.
Who watches the watch?
So that ties in quite nicely with what you were talking about with haunted democracy, right? So much of this last 2 years of Western politics has happened on Twitter. It's become a real center of the debate. The news organizations are showing who's tweeted what. Everyone's following Donald Trump's tweets, aggressively. Who was it we were talking to who said they look forward to going home every day and seeing what Donald Trump's tweeted? I can't remember. but is that if our democracy takes place on that platform and that platform is 54% bots, is that a haunted democracy?
Good question. I mean, I don't know. If it's a moment of democracy when bots are, I mean, I think, I don't know. I don't know. What is, how are we going to redefine democracy in this age, I guess, is the question. I don't know. I have no idea if you can say that, if democracy itself, if decisions related to politics are not ours anymore. I don't know. I don't know what that is anymore. What I wanted to sort of say though, is to go back to your initial question, which you might have to clarify for me because it was a long time ago. But you started off by saying that you wanted to know if there are narratives. I mean, there are alternative narratives that sort of present positive possibilities, I think you said.
Yeah, or challenge the hegemony of what our vision of future politics.
And I think that led me, when you said that, I was thinking, first of all, about Gothic narratives, and I'm the one using the term Gothic all the time, I'm sorry. But I'm kind of categorizing your theme my own way, but I think there's something interesting about, there's an old debate about the Gothic, that it's an inherently conservative form or genre or approach or mode, whatever you want to call it, that it's inherently conservative. I mean, ghost stories are designed to scare you into Christianity. Slasher movies are designed to show you who the slut is in the scene and get rid of her, kind of thing. So I think Gothic culture has been largely seen as being reactionary and conservative, but I don't know. I'm not thoroughly convinced of that myself, and I wonder sometimes about the possibilities of narrative itself. That is it so much that we need to re-engineer narrative, or do we already have something useful? When you look at themes like haunted machines, is the haunted machine a very useful trope for this? Do you have to tweak it for positive results? Zombie films, for example, are widely seen as being, highly political, and these are movies that supposedly, confront society with the notion of political, inactivity and inertia, and the zombie is kind of like the symbol of that. Is there a way that we can come up with haunted machines or even Gothic tropes that do that help us to rethink our place in the world, rethink power in the world, rethink structures of domination, how they relate to us in the world, in the way that things like zombie films can. Is there something already ingrained in the notion of the haunted machine that we can use?
It's almost kind of going back to that. Whenever I think of Gothic literature, I think about Wide Sargasso Sea by John Rhys, which is like a fantastic book which essentially reimagines kind of Lord Rochester and the original Lady Rochester from Wuthering Heights. That's it. And it kind of uses the terms of the Gothic, which is on a book that already was Gothic, in a different way to kind of go, we're going to use this way to shine a light on actually the things that you didn't see of this very romantic Gothic book. And it's not quite the Audre Lorde using the master's tools to deconstruct the master's house, but it's something like, I don't know, it's something completely different, and I don't know if I can pinpoint it very well. But I do like the idea of maybe where there's gaps. Again, fan fiction is another point of that. Like, and they go back to things like Afrofutures and Sun Ra, where there's an alternate narratives being pulled out of there, and where trying to find the gaps and turns.
One of the things that we often talk about when we're introducing this idea of haunted machines is Edgar Allan Poe. One of the most famous Gothic horror writers of all time, but also one of the world's first technology critics. He wrote treatises criticizing various automata and stuff that were around at the time and trying to expose cons in sort of showmanship and frameworks. A little bit of that with Houdini and trying to unveil mediums and things like that. So that way of thinking in the Gothic way, through horror, through examination, through tropes, gave him what he called ratiocination, the ability to think around a problem and then see it from different angles in order to critique it, which he did in a very famous essay about the Mechanical Turk, which is something we often use as a way of talking about how horror gives you a unique ability to exaggerate and thus expose relations in stories that we're told, I suppose. So I'm interested because I read some of your stuff in your blurb, and this is going back a bit to what we were talking about, but what is the Caribbean Gothic and how does it relate to the European Gothic?
Wow. Okay, I think you raised White Sargasso Sea. I think it's a great place to start. But maybe, I don't know. I think it's a great place to start because it gives us a place in literature to start from. And White Sargasso Sea was of course a kind of humanizing novel. It was an attempt to sort of humanize Bertha Mason from Jane Eyre. From Jane Eyre. But okay, so there are those sort of, there is a real kind of historical connection between there's a whole genealogy of Caribbean literature that is connected in some ways, like White Sargasso Sea is with the British Gothic. You have Matthew Lewis as well, who was a famous British.
No, your microphone to your microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. You have people like Matthew Monk Lewis, for example, who wrote the famous novel The Monk, one of the early Gothic novels, who was also a plantation owner in Jamaica, and wrote his diary is called Diary of a West India Proprietor, which was published a long time ago now, but he, of course, is also another sort of figure who actually sits at that intersection between Caribbean fiction and European fiction. But I would argue, from an anthropological perspective, that the Gothic is it is entirely possible to speak of the Gothic without referencing Europe. Although the European Gothic is the Gothic we all know, we all kind of whether art history or popular culture, this is the Gothic we sort of come in contact with. But there, of course, the Gothic is what we call the Gothic is something that is quite, I would say, even again, that word universal. Every culture has ghost stories. Every culture has a Gothic dimension of some kind, and I think that. I don't know where I was going with this. I really feel like Gothic. I really don't know where I was going with this. I'm sorry. Your question, the last part of the question was.
What's the relationship between the Caribbean and European Gothic? Right.
What I was going to say is yes. So there is a universal Gothic. So there is. There is a real relationship. There's also a kind of, I don't know. There's a relationship to the Gothic in a very generic, transcultural sense that all cultures produce these kinds of forms. But also, I feel like I'm speaking about, for the most part, a creolization, which is about the encounter between Europe and for the most part, Europe and the rest of the world. So. I think the very product, the very culture I'm talking about is a culture that in some ways, in some form is a product of Europe and its relationship to the world. So there's no way of speaking of something like the Caribbean Gothic without, of course, including Europe and referencing it.
So there's an artist in our program called Tabitha Reza who kind of looks at again the meeting of European and kind of African kind of traditions around the internet, and particularly how in the West, sort of the internet is kind of innovative, very very fast-moving, very disruptive idea, while in kind of Africa, it's often used as kind of a place where healing and meditation happens, and particularly that sort of mirror of an organic kind of a subject almost, where it can be as easily kind of, the viruses are very sort of visceral, plant-like things. But there's an interesting kind of, she tries to meet them because she's a French Guyanese artist, and obviously is sitting in that place where there's a kind of European and African influence. I do wonder where there's those other sort of creolizations of digital culture that do occur, and if there's any that you've seen
Like what cultures?
creolization of like digital culture, that you perhaps find interesting, or maybe the panel find interesting, but if there are any.
Let me think about that.
Yeah.
Creolization of digital cultures, okay. Anybody wants to?
Is there a Hollywood Gothic? Why is Christopher Nolan so annoying?
It's good. Well, it's the Bain Occupy, yeah.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when I think of Gothic, I think of Edgar Allan Poe, and I think of that critical approach to social trends. Of course, there was, the whole ghost come because you're not good enough Christian, but then there was, Poe and Lovecraft also, but he was also a bit weird. Let's not talk about him. And that was very much about re-examining cultural myths and presenting them through horror stories, in those short stories and his investigative stuff. And again, that to me is Gothic culture. And so there are elements of wondering what happens when that's Hollywoodized as well as when it's turned into modern novels, right? So the Twilight series completely disrupts the vampire mythology to a degree and changes it and makes it
terrible. Is that why it disrupts it? 'Cause it's terrible.
It's disrupting. I don't know what happens when the Gothic meets Hollywood and those different ambitions align.
Yeah.
I mean, that has a long history, of Hollywood doing the Gothic in a lot of different ways. I think, what I think is more interesting than the Hollywoodization of the Gothic is the ways in which independent filmmakers, from George Romero onto more contemporary artists, have turned horror tropes against themselves, and created. Like Night of the Living Dead is kind of in its own way a Gothic film, but it's also a film that is, hugely political. That is, about race, civil rights, about gender. It's about the generation gap in the 1960s. It's about it's a thoroughly political film, but of course it could only be made outside of the film industry by a guy making industrial films in Pittsburgh, begging, borrowing, and stealing to get 16mm film together to get this thing done. And that is a thing where I think that the general process. Talking about Hollywoodization, right? You're talking about the kind of culture industry. And what the culture industry does is produce commodities for our enjoyment. And that term enjoyment is so fundamental to our experience of it and the commercial success that something has that it tends to pollute everything that it touches. And reaching back to what we were talking about to your presentation just now, or the talk about phobias and the politics and the rhetoric of fear, I have the sense that the right wing, the far right, has been very good over the past several years. It's always been good at mobilizing fear. The left really hasn't. I mean, if you think about climate change, I don't think we're afraid enough, by a long shot, right? Afraid of enough of climate change. Now and then we get a little inkling of it, but in the same way that smoking doesn't terrify us, because you think it's incremental and it's something, even if you're buying packages that are literally just illustrations of lungs destroyed by cancer, you're still like, yeah, but even if it happens, I'll be old, or whatever, right? So, whereas the language of Islamophobia, of xenophobia, of refugee phobia, all those kinds of things, they're like, no, they're coming today and they're taking your jobs tomorrow, and then they're raping your daughters the day after. So it's like there's a kind of immediacy to that kind of rhetoric of fear that is very, very different from the kind of much generally centrist left-wing type of discourse. And I mean, somebody like China Miéville, like a science fiction or a weird author, has spoken and written many times about the necessity for the left to reincorporate the monstrous in its vocabulary. And part of that is also like an academic tradition, the academic tradition of scholars, literary scholars, sort of dismissing anything that is mystical or irrational, right? The monstrous as being something that's reactionary. And everything has to be like, completely rational. Science fiction is okay because it's progressive and it's technological, whereas horror and fantasy are not because they're irrational and mystical. It's like, no. We need monsters on the left because we need to mobilize fear more strongly if we're going to persuade anybody.
But would you say it's not just about fear? An argument that Nick Cernacek makes is that it's not even just about fear, it's about any vision of the future.
Yes.
The left as a politics of resistance doesn't have its own vision. The right has a vision of the future, it's a scary one. But the left doesn't.
Yes.
It's just like, we don't want that, and we don't want that, and we don't want that.
That's right.
Isn't it a matter that fear is stronger than enlightenment then?
Well, that's what goes all the way back to Burke, right? It's like, so it's like, the sublime or fear is death is death and pain are stronger emotions than pleasure. Yeah. So, we respond more viscerally to them.
Live Googling.
And I think, and I think the left, like if you talk to communists, they have a pretty good fucking idea about what the future should be and can be, right? It's just that those on the far left, not the extreme violent far left, but the radical left, where I place myself, they have a pretty clear idea for the future and a pretty clear idea who to fight, like for instance fascists, right? But one of the problems is that the centrist, vaguely liberal media, including Hollywood, including those who produce and present the news, they're sort of in this position where they're like, no, we have to, like, there's what about the other side?
And it's the same with the climate argument going right back, right? You got 99 scientists saying it's real, one doesn't, but they got to balance it.
Then you got to say, well, let's hear one from each side, exactly. Yeah.
You've got live memeing.
I didn't find it, sorry. It's okay.
What were you gonna?
No, I was actually going to bring up, just to address this question of the left not having a culture of fear, that I'm wondering if that's changing now. I'm wondering if we're in a different time and place, just because what I was trying to...
You need to mute the mic.
We can't
Sorry,
hear you.
what did everybody hear that? Do I have to? Okay. I'm wondering if this has changed now, if what we're living in is a world in which this fear has become possible, the fear of the left. And I was going to Google a meme that was circulated, I think, the week of the elections in the U.S. last November, but it was I can't remember which of Goya's pieces anymore, but it was some of you might have seen it, but it was this really apocalyptic piece, with these Goya paintings with things eating each other and picking things up and dismembered heads and so on. But this was supposedly a meme that was circulated humorously, I think, a few days before the elections, but it was called The Day After. And this is what America was going to look like. It was going to look like a Goya painting. And guess what? It kind of happened, right? It kind of happened exactly that way. But I think that was one probably very humorous example. But I think there are many examples now of this new, well, of course, Donald Trump himself being the sort of monster. But we have this, I think Antifa and some of these groups are now showing us that there is a left that is terrified. And the world over, it is extremely terrified. It is extremely mobilized. It's, I think, at this point in time, being marginalized, but it's there. And I don't know if that's where that's where we need to look for this new. And I totally agree with your point as well, that fear, we can use fear. Fear can be useful for the left. Yeah.
I would just be concerned that we end up in 5 years where the discourse is which is the least scary option.
But that's the danger, and that's the danger with focusing too much on Trump. Also, that's the danger of saying the monster is Trump, right? It's like, no, that's the symptom of the monster that is much less palpable. The monsters are white supremacy. The monsters
systemic
are
inequality.
The monsters are all of these cultural. These ideas that have this long, deeply ingrained cultural tradition that people need to be able to face and understand before they're able to move beyond them. And those are the things that have played into both of these decisions, Brexit and the rise and Trump and the rise of the far right here. Yeah. And the fact that just this morning on, Buitenhof, people are having a discussion about cultural Marxism. as if that's a neutral term that exists in the world that you can just talk about, and that's not just blatant Nazi propaganda. So we have one from each side. We have somebody from the Groene Amsterdammer saying, well, cultural Marxism is kind of a bullshit term. And we have somebody from the VVD saying, no, this is a danger that threatens the very fabric of our society, and we need to understand it better. So we have this weird moment where, I guess, Nazis don't scare us enough anymore.
Right. Yeah. Well, one last thing to say to that is just that monsters have to be embodied.
Yes.
And I think the problem with the left is that all monsters have been disembodied monsters. Homophobia, sexism, racism. We don't have a tradition of embodied monsters like the black man or the immigrant. So this is the thing. And is it a bad thing to go in that direction anyway? Is it bad to do that? Is it bad to demonize Trump, for example?
On that note, I'm afraid we've actually run out of time.
And I would encourage you to watch the China Miaville Halloween lecture on YouTube. It's one of the best hour and 15 minutes you can spend, really.
He's so angry, it's great.
So angry, and it's got a really great story about an octopus and coconut shells that's dynamite.
Anyway, talking of octopus and coconut shells, it's time for us to go for the spiel clock.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Not yet, it's at 4:30, isn't it?
Let's thank all our guests. We've had Dr. Edward Acken and Tola Hubbard, and Dan Hassler Forrest, Raina Hoffman, and Simone Nickel. We've got coming up on the 19th of October, Spring and Autumn, with Dries Verhoeven's co-presentation begins there, and then Impact 25th to 29th of October. You can go to the website. The early bird tickets are out now on discount, and there's a list of many of the people taking part, and that's constantly being updated, all the artists and speakers and so on and so forth. We're going to the Spiel Clock now for a guided tour, but also at
4:30. So don't go just yet.
At 4:30, but also this evening at 8:30 in the City Hall Square. We have a screening of one of the films that's going to be featured in the programme from the general director Arjen Dunnevind, who's going to be introducing that. Have I forgotten anything? No, perfect, nailed it, first time. Okay, all right. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks, our guests.
Thank you.
Thank you.